Hi, everyone. Sorry we're getting started a little late. There have been some technical difficulties with Divyanshi's camera, and we haven't really been able to solve them. So we're just going to go ahead and get started. Sans camera. Um, Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. And I'm very, very excited for today's talk. I've been looking forward to it for a while, actually. Um, uh, and so I'm just going to let Divyanshi introduce herself and take it from here.
All right. I'm really sorry about the situation, but I guess this is the best we have. I'll start presenting in a few minutes, in just a few seconds. Uh, but in the meantime, I'll do a quick introduction. All right. I'm Divyanshi Wadhwa. I'm a data scientist at the World Bank. Can you see my screen? Zane, could you confirm?
Yes.
Fantastic. Um, all right. The topic of my presentation is presenting complete pictures without complete data. I'm a data scientist at the World Bank, and really the very first thing I'm going to mention is that we're going to change the topic of this conversation a little bit. And that's because complete pictures are a little bit of a misnomer, according to me. And what I mean by that is that having complete picture is oftentimes nearly impossible, especially in the context of international development data. And so we're going to say presenting global pictures without complete data. I might refer back to the idea of complete pictures towards the end of the presentation. So I hope you stay tuned up until then. But before I jump into this topic at length, I do want to give you a quick brief on why is there a data scientist at the World Bank talking about data visualization, or why even is there a data scientist at the World Bank at all. I'm sorry you can't see me, but I hope you can imagine me. I'll go ahead and talk about some of the work we do at the bank in just a few minutes, and then get started on data visualization very shortly. So as you might know, the World Bank is created so that we can have a world free of poverty on a livable planet. What we do is provide loans to countries for development, especially for low income countries and lots of middle income countries as well. But other than this, we actually also do some other work, which is provide knowledge through research and data to inform policymaking and to create awareness about global development. Our topics in terms of giving loans ranges from education to infrastructure to improve protecting the environment, and similarly, that's true for the data as well. And that's the work that I do. I focus on providing knowledge is sort of this very meta way of describing the work. And within the work that we do, there is a research group that provides research. There's a data group that manages and produces data. And what we often say is that we bring data from farm to table, which is we go into the field, we collect the data, we use that data and process it. We also take data from the governments and use that data to make it into comparable statistics, and then manage that data and disseminate it to the rest of the world, to make it a global public good so that it can be used further for research, for decision making by policymakers, for journalists, and for the general public to just create awareness about the general development global trends. Lastly, we also use this data on our own and do our own analysis and presentation of this information through communication tools like the Sustainable Development Goals Atlas. That's one of the products that I work on. But before I jump into that product, I'll quickly mention what I do as a data scientist in the indicators team, and that's the team. That's what my team is called. It's called the indicators team. I focus on four main products, or three main products, and sort of some ancillary other things. The first one is the World Development Indicators database. It's a compilation of about 1,500 indicators that tries to measure global development. It's pretty selective in the kinds of indicators it puts together, but the idea is to have the best quality indicators that are out there to give us information about global development. And these are country time series data, which means at any point, if you access the WDI, you will have country level data over a period of time. We go back to 1970, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and then from there on. Of course, all of that data is not complete. There's a lot of missingness, and we try to address it at the best we can. We also have some criteria and how we choose which indicators go in, which indicators stay out. We keep a lookout for other indicators. We try to assess what kind of gaps exist, especially with the changing times in terms of technology, in terms of the need for protecting the environment and climate change, etc. The second thing that I focus on is the gender data portal, which really is kind of similar to the WDI in that it's also a compilation of country time series data, but it's focused on gender, and it's really for people who want to deep dive into gender statistics. They can go to this portal and access the website. So here I actually also manage building the portal itself. So what does the data infrastructure look like? What does the data dissemination process look like? And so on. Um, but those are sort of the ancillary ones to what we will be talking about today. Today we'll be talking about data visualization, and one of the main products that we produce that uses data visualizations is the Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals. The last one that came out was a year ago in June 2023, and we are starting to think about what the next one is going to look like. We were very fortunate to get recognized at the Information is Beautiful Awards last year, and it was a very exciting event for us to be there. And basically, this atlas is built on the agreed upon goals that all United Nations member states came together to agree on in 2015. And they said that we want to achieve these 17 goals by 2030. And of these 17 goals, they came up with a long list of 169 targets. And those 169 targets are measured by 230 plus indicators. Now, that's a pretty big swath of data. And the idea behind the Atlas is to try to use that information and write some stories and show the data through visualizations so that we can bring that knowledge, bring that information to a broad audience, not just the nerds behind the computers like me who love to look at these numbers and love to show off the statistics we remember, but really to bring it to everybody who aren't like obsessed with these numbers on a day-to-day basis. Lastly, I also provide research support, analytical support to teams at the bank. Because I focus on gender data, I do some gaps analysis on gender. And lastly, I also do trainings on data visualization and data management for people internally within the bank, but also for national statistical offices in government. So we work with them to improve the capacity that they have to manage their data, disseminate their data, and make that data publicly available and use that information for policy making, hopefully. Okay. A quick slide on how did I get here. There are three main buckets into what I focus on. One is data, one is storytelling, and the other is policy research. I actually don't do policy research specifically anymore. I do data research, but I do have a background in it. I studied political science in India. That's where I am right now, actually, just on leave, visiting my family. I grew up in New Delhi, and I moved to the US almost exactly 10 years ago to study public policy because I missed numbers a lot. I was kind of obsessed with numbers as I was growing up, and I realized that even though my interests were in political science, I really excelled in mathematics and I missed it a lot. So when I pursued my degree in public policy, I pursued courses in data visualization, data science, really tried to make it as quantitatively focused as I could. And then I got into policy research for a couple of years. And after that, I also was interested in journalism for a long time. I did a few stints here and there in terms of journalism. And so really, I tried to bring these three things together in my work at the bank. I got hired about 6 years ago as a junior data scientist, and my work was to manage data at the WDI but also do data visualization. And that has sort of expanded a lot in the last few years because of the hunger for data communication, really. So it's been a great, exciting space, and I'm happy to chat more about this. But now I'll really get back into the topic that we started off with. Um, so a quick mention of the Atlas again. This is what the Atlas looks like. I'll show the website very shortly, actually, because I'll use a lot of examples from the Atlas. And like I mentioned, the Atlas uses a large swath of data. So what would be helpful, I think, just for a couple of minutes, is to show you what kind of data exists out there, how do we get data for the Atlas, and then how do we use it. So where does our data come from? It comes from surveys conducted by national statistical offices. For example, poverty rate data or time spent on unpaid care and domestic work. These kinds of surveys are conducted by different governments through their national statistical offices. They send this data to us or to other international organizations like the UN Women for gender data, or UNICEF for child and youth related data, or ILO for labor related data, and so on. And we compile this data and make it available at the country level, because we're sort of the ones who are trying to make sure that they're comparable across countries and robust in terms of their quality and methodology. Then there are some indicators that actually come directly from international agencies. We do conduct our own surveys. The World Bank does a survey called the LSMS, which is the Living Standards Measurement Study. UNICEF does a lot of its own surveys like DHS and MIX. That's USAID. DHS is USAID, MIX is UNICEF, and so on and so forth. And these surveys also contribute in large amounts to the data that we produce for the SDGs. Then, of course, there's administrative data that just is collected by the government by default, like representation of women and men in national parliaments or what the GDP is. We get that data again from the governments. For example, for GDP data, we get that data from the government through IMF. And then, of course, this is also data that's coming from governments, but it's instrument based. So I wanted to keep it separate because it's not focused on surveys, or it's not something that's in a register or in an Excel or through the bank. It's really like an actual instrument that's measuring temperature and so on. And then lastly, there are some statistics that are modeled estimates. We don't have complete data. We have some survey data perhaps, or maybe we don't even have full survey data. We make some assumptions and we impute that data based on some existing information that we have. And children and employment, actually, that is based partially on surveys and then imputed quite often. And surgical procedures is actually one example where we don't have real data because it's hard to have a good count of it. But what we do have is we have lots of assumptions on what kind of procedures happen. And then based on that, national statistics are built. Now, how do we present a global picture with missing data? Like I mentioned before, it's impossible to have a complete picture. What's even more important for us to acknowledge at this point is that it's even more difficult to have complete data. Complete data in terms of international development would basically mean that we have complete information about ourselves, of all 8 billion of us, in terms of our income, our behaviors, when did we have children, when did we eat, how much time did we spend, and that's really impossible, if not close to. And so in order to present global pictures, we have to deal with missing information, or we have to deal with just the closest to representative information that we can have. Oftentimes, that is still not available. For example, this is actually a screenshot from the poverty and inequality platform that my team manages at the World Bank. And the World Bank is responsible for producing the poverty statistic globally. And so this is the first thing you see as soon as you come to this platform. You will see this big number, global idea, 712 million people today still live in extreme poverty, which basically means that they live below $2.15 per day. And you see this chart about how poverty has reduced tremendously from 1990 to 2022. But still, it's a pretty large number of people who live in extreme poverty today. And if you look at the country coverage is actually of 176 economies out of the 218 that we count in WDI as being like close to a complete set. Um, when you dig further into it, it's actually covers about 90% of the population, which is slightly better than having 176 economies out of 218. So we do have actually 90% of the information on poverty. But even then, we are still presenting information and numbers without the last 10%. Um, we do this because this is the best information that's available to us out there. And for that remaining 10%, we do have to come up with some kind of assumptions, use some imputations from previous data that we have, from neighboring countries that we have, or perhaps even regional data that we have. So we try our best to make it as complete as possible, but it is always based on some amount of assumptions. But one thing to note is when we have a global statistic, the availability of it has a pretty significant trade-off with accuracy of these statistics. So when you see a global number, I think it's natural for us to have those kinds of questions on how can this be accurate? Do we really have that kind of information? Um, our job is to make sure that it is the best number that's out there and then present it in the way that's most effective. Now, one quick mention is when can we actually have global data? I'll give a pretty frustrating answer, which is that it totally depends on the context, which seems like the most obvious answer as well. But I'll try to simplify it a little bit further. The reason it depends a lot on the context, as you might imagine, let's take the poverty case again. Let's say not 90%, but only 50% of the population data was available, and we only had information for high income countries. In that case, poverty would look pretty low because we don't have data for low and middle income countries where there is likely to be higher poverty rates. And so your number is going to be pretty misinformed. So these are 6 buckets. I won't go through each of them, but these are the 6 buckets that really start giving you a sense of like how to put the number into context and see whether you have enough information or not to tell a global story. And these are the considerations we take into mind when we present these global statistics. But when we do present these global statistics, we present them through visualizations very often, and I'll walk you through this particular visualization quickly. One thing I skipped was a general principle we have used is the absolute low barrier is that the data for at least half of the relevant population must be available. I have added a link to a blog post that also then links to a full paper on doing some computations on when the trade-off between the amount of data you have and accuracy just shifts so completely that you really need to not have a global statistic. And the number that came out was about 50%. A few of my colleagues worked on this paper. I would encourage you to take a look and see if that can help you present your data better and also raise questions when you see some global statistics. Now back to this. This is a visual from the atlas, so I'll go quickly to the atlas if you don't mind. I hope you can still see my slide, my screen. This is from the first chapter on global poverty, and here what we are showing is the progress in ending extreme poverty. Everything below the red line shows the number of people who are poor, who are below earning $2.15 a day, equivalent to what that was in 1990 in back then. And if you scroll further, at that time, basically, there were about 2 billion people who lived in extreme poverty. Today, like we just discussed, the number is closer to, this is actually now 1 year old, so the number has got updated. This says 660 million, but there was actually an increase in poverty during COVID. So from 2019 to 2022, the number actually jumped up. But at the time we had 2019 data, and at that time 660 million people were in extreme poverty. So when you have global data like this, I would encourage you to use it, present those global and regional statistics in the best way possible, and present them as a total, present them in a way that shows the world as one rather than presenting information as separate countries. However, when we don't have this information at the global level, what we can do is we can focus on the trend rather than on a specific global estimate. Um, this is also one visual from the atlas. It's from the gender equality chapter. I was one of the co-authors for it, and I will show you a lot of examples from this chapter because it's just something I work on pretty closely. And here we actually have presented data for only 67 countries, I think. I counted it this afternoon when I downloaded the data. And but we can still, and so we obviously can't build a global statistic from it, but we can still present a general trend, especially when it's this obvious. And as you can see from the title, basically in all countries, men spend less time engaged in unpaid and domestic work compared to women. Here, of course, as you can see, the blue dots are men and the yellow dots are women. All right. So this is one tip, in my opinion, on how you can present global statistics or global pictures without having these big global aggregate numbers. Another example is from one of the blogs that I had written, but I'll skip because it's really very similar. Another aspect that I would like to show is that sometimes we don't even have country level statistics. Sometimes the amount of data that we have is so little that we have to rely on case studies. And one experimental case that we had was doing a story on gender and climate change for the Atlas last year. There were absolutely no national statistics available because it's a new topic. We have only recently started looking at whether there is a differential impact by gender when there is a climate change event or whether when there's a climate shock. But there are actually many studies on climate shocks which show this kind of data. Um, it's just that they are sometimes at a case study level or they look at specific countries at one time. There aren't any global comparable statistics at the country level. So, what we did is that we tried to use these studies in the way as close to effective as we could make it. So, one of the first things we did was we tried to explain what the global phenomenon was, and then we described what the case study was. So, let me again take one example. I'll stick to this visual here, but perhaps I could show it to you um, a little bit better here. All right. So one of the issues that women face often is that there is a bit of time poverty in terms of the responsibilities that they have at the house, which often prevents them from other types of activities like spending time in education or spending time in income generating activities because they have a higher share of responsibility for domestic and unpaid care work. One of the things that is included in that is the responsibility for water collection in rural areas. Now, as you may know, in a lot of areas, there isn't enough water that reaches the taps. And so many a times people have to fetch that water from far off distances. This is actually a pretty high number, the share of people who have to do this. I would encourage you to take a look at the story to learn a bit more about that. But as you can see, again, the yellow part is women and the blue part is men. And in India, about women were responsible for this in 42% of the households, whereas men were responsible in 7%. The remaining data is basically means that it was either shared responsibility or this information was not disclosed to in this survey. And so these are pretty staggering numbers. Now, we wanted to show a case study of this when there is actually a drought. What happens when something like that happens? And we found this really well structured study um, uh, from from a from a PhD student in University of Chicago. It's well published and it's well researched. And so we try to present that data through this visualization. Now, what we're doing here is we're showing all the data that we have from Uganda on the number of hours spent by people who spend up to 10 hours, 20 hours, etc., on fetching water. This basically, the height shows you how what is the share of people that are spending time in this category, which is 1 to 5 hours per week, and then 6 to 10 hours per week, and so on and so forth. Once we scroll further into it, you'll see that because the yellow part goes across from the 50% line, women are more likely to spend time than men in Uganda on this work. And this is during normal weather. No shocks have been faced. And this is if you see the gender breakdown. So you'll actually see that a lot of adult women and teenage girls have this responsibility, uh, and fewer men. Now, when there is a drought, this becomes a much more extreme situation where the yellow really takes over this chart. Basically, that means that many more women are, or women are spending much more time on fetching water because of longer distances and perhaps, more trips in order to get the amount of water that they need. And the time spent by men actually didn't change at all. And so we present this information through this case study, but connecting this information with the global phenomenon, we're able to somewhat successfully connect the dots that, there is a global problem about how fetching water, the responsibility of fetching water is largely on women. And when there is a drought, which is a big climate shock, and likely there are more to happen with the climate changing very frequently, or at a fast pace, this responsibility, this burden will only increase for women and really steal time from women even more in terms of doing other activities like spending time in education or income generating activities. So that was one example. Another example of how we use uh, some of our data and our knowledge to present data in a way that's uh, try to make it a global picture, but it's really quite specific to a case study. But we are hopefully able to present it in a way that drives the point across other areas as well. Now, the third issue that I'm going to discuss is the lack of timeliness in data. Um, the development data life cycle is really long. We go into the fields, we collect data, that data goes to the governments, then from the governments it comes to the international organizations. We process that data, double check that data, it goes back to governments, it gets verified. And, it takes a minimum of a year and at least 2 to 3 years, if you ask me, maybe sometimes more. And because of that, if we collect data in 2019, we don't have that available up until 2013 or 2023 up in our portals. So the data that we have is always going to be a little bit stale. And there is some work going on in terms of nowcasting, which is trying to predict the data, the values for today, based on the data that we have from 4 years ago. But again, like we said, mentioned earlier before, that there are some trade-offs with accuracy. So how do we deal with this problem? Sometimes data for one country is available from 2015, another from 2019. Um, there is one advantage that we have because all surveys can't happen in one go. Um, they're often staggered between different countries, and so we can't have all data in one go. What comes into being an advantage for us is that development data doesn't actually change very quickly because development changes take time. They take resources, money, change in behaviors. So things don't change from year to year. You can imagine the poverty rate in a country changing from 30 to 29 from one year to the next, or even in the next 2 to 3 years, but it won't change from 30 to 15 in a 2 to 3 year period. If that happens, that's a pretty stark situation. And so we use this as a way to present our information by putting together the most recent values available. Now, this is a chart. I'm a big fan of this chart, so I will show it in the interactive way. Um, basically, if you hover on this, you can actually look at the data for each country. You can type that data as well. It will highlight it so that it's a little bit easier for you to take a look. And it shows where countries where more than 50% of graduates are female and countries where more than 50% of graduates are male. As you can see, for science and technology or the STEM field, blue is prominent, which means in almost all countries, more than 50% of graduates are male. And for some countries, it's nearly all graduates are actually men from the STEM programs. So this kind of tells you a little bit of the the fields that the two genders are going into, and we have a longer piece in the story about green jobs and how it connects to that. But I won't get into that. I just wanted to mention that we don't have data for every year here. So we actually use data from 2010 to 2019, and we take the most recent value available for each country and present that information together. Now, again, there is a little bit of trade off in terms of accuracy here. Older data will be less accurate. Um, but the good news is that we can still present some information and put these general trends together, so that we can at least have some information, given that international development information is quite bereft with missing data. Now, I know I'm close to finishing up on time, so I'll try to be quick on this last point. Now, this is a hat tip to what I started off with, which is we can't really tell complete stories, but we want to try and attempt telling complete stories, and it requires carefully selecting information that is relevant and is represented accurately. I'll give you an example, which is a bad one, which I think is the best way to learn data viz. I hope everyone has gone through those bad charts to find a way to learn more about good data viz. And this is one example. This chart shows in 3 years, Malaysia reduced poverty at more than double the pace compared to Indonesia. You will see that the Indonesia line drops to close to 37%, and the Malaysia one drops to like 85%. So Malaysia was actually able to reduce its poverty by 85% in 3 years. Now, that's a pretty staggering number unless you see this chart, which shows that Malaysia reduced poverty by zero point 0.6 percentage points and Indonesia reduced poverty by 9 percentage points. Now, the percent changes here were actually fully accurate, and I'm not saying percent changes aren't useful. A lot of times they are. But sometimes they can be misused or they can be used without enough context, and that prevents us from telling a complete story. Presenting this information in this way, where the poverty in Malaysia really changed from 0.7% to 0.1%, but in Indonesia it changed from 24% to 15%, we get a more complete picture of where change happened more rapidly than just the first chart. Now, there are a couple of good examples that I can show from the atlas, but because we're running out of time, I'll just focus on this one very quickly. This is on who contributes most to global greenhouse gas emissions. We often hear US, China, India are some of the biggest GHG emitters, and that is true. But if we don't account for population, we will only be able to tell that global story. But when we account for population, we see some of the top emitters are often some countries in the Middle East, like Qatar and Bahrain. And this visualization that many of you probably know is called the Marimekko chart, tries to present both those statistics here in one go and tell that complete story. The area shows the amount of emissions totally that are emitted by that country in total, whereas the height of the bar just shows you the amount of emission per capita. So it gives you a little bit of flavor of both those things and hopefully tell a more complete story. I will stop here so that I can also answer questions. If you want to know a little bit more about this, I can also walk you through the last example that I have. But I hope we can get into the questions more quickly, so I'll pause here. Back to you, Zain.
That was very informational. Thank you so much. We already have a question from Glinda. I'm going to put that on screen. what authoring/platform tool or programming is used for the visualization?
All right. For the Atlas, we actually used custom JavaScript. We used libraries like D3 and Svelte. We actually make all of that code available on GitHub. So if you want to try to replicate some of those charts and try to take some of that information, you can go to the GitHub pages and take that information. But that is very specific to the Atlas. Generally, at the bank, we use a pretty big variety of tools. I think a lot of database people like to say this, that we try to be tool agnostic, which is let's try to think about what is the best way to do the visualization. And once we figure that out, we can figure out what is the best tool for it. For example, oftentimes we want to do something very specific, but it doesn't need to be interactive. So we use simple rggplot charting, which I think is phenomenal and still unbeatable in terms of non-interactive visuals. When we do want quick visualizations that are interactive, we use some online tools like Data Wrapper and Flourish that are out there, and really put out our material on social media a lot through those two platforms. And then lastly, when we do some dashboarding work, we use our Shiny often as to create dashboards. That's usually our preferred tool in terms of the data group, because we can always refresh the data a lot more easily, refresh the code a lot more easily. But the ones who aren't as comfortable with coding, they also rely on Tableau and Power BI. Yeah, those are, so it's pretty much everything, but it really depends on what we are trying to do, and then we make a decision on which tool to use.
We also had a request for the GitHub link, and that's something that I can either send afterwards or post online with this video when it goes up on YouTube.
I will put all this information in the slides so that it's all in one place.
And then Carrie asked for a quick recap again of those platform names. So I remember Flourish, R Shiny, D3.
Yeah, I'll just type them down. I can also add this information to the slides. Sorry, I'm coughing. I'm not very used to talking for an hour nonstop. So there you go. But I'm trying to solve it. All right, our Shiny for dashboards, online tools, ggplot in R for non-interactive. Okay. I have just sent that message. I hope that's informative enough.
It's definitely a very thorough list. So while we wait for more questions to come in, one that I had was at the beginning, you gave a list of different sources where you guys collect data from: NSO survey data, international agencies, government administrations, instrument-based and modeling estimates from governments and research organizations. In terms of accessibility for early career practitioners, which of those are like the easiest to start working with and using their data for projects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm glad to say that I have a good answer for it, because that's a lot of the work that we do. A lot of our work is actually taking these surveys and putting those numbers onto the platforms that are readily available. So you'll see some links on the slides to WDI, to the General Data Portal. Those are all country time series statistics that are already there for you to use the data. And so we've already done some of the work of making sure that they're comparable across countries, that there's a time series, and so on. However, if you want to go into the microdata behind it, I would encourage you to go into the microdata library. I can send a link to that as well. That basically has a lot of surveys that are out there. Another tool that I absolutely love that comes from the DHS or it's funded by the USAID is called the Stat Compiler. You can actually choose the indicator that you want to look into. You can choose the population and it does the aggregations for you. So I think it's a pretty simple tool for anyone to use, and I can share that also in my slides. I'll try to put all of these resources in the last couple of slides.
Glinda has asked another question. What words of encouragement would you give undergraduate, graduate students majoring in data science?
Oh, I see. I think the world is your garden right now. It's such a great time to be in data. The world is changing so quickly. One thing I would say in terms of a tip, I'm not sure if it's encouraging. I hope it is that um, beyond going to school, you can continue learning data science. I hope you do, because that's kind of how I stayed in the field. I came from this quantitative public policy background, but to really get into data science, I had to, dip my toes into different types of coding. And because the environment is changing so quickly, your background in data science at school will be really, really important to build off from, but you will want to keep yourself adaptable and learn new skills later on. And so you want to keep that mindset quite flexible that if there's a new tool that's out there, you're willing to learn it. Another thing that maybe is the other side of it is that I've seen that um, because we can so heavily rely on ChatGPT and Claude AI and whatnot for coding, coding has become much easier. What I have noticed is that it's even easier if you really know the basics of it. So it's, I think, great that you're already studying data science so that you're not just relying on code that you can find online, but you also understand how it works and why those quantitative principles make sense through that code. So I hope that's some encouragement.
Elaine has asked a rather broad question. What books or resources would you recommend to become better at data visualization, such as best practice? Perhaps we can narrow this down to your realm of expertise. What books or resources would you recommend in terms of working with survey data?
Survey data. Survey data is quite tricky. I don't know if I have a specific book in terms of recommending a resource. I would say I think you should follow a few of these products online. Obviously, I talked about the Atlas. Try to look into it and see how you can replicate some of that information. Don't try to use JavaScript. Just try to use an online tool. Try to use rggplot and try to replicate some of that information. All of the data is available for you to download and then just use it. So go ahead, look into the data, download it and use it, and then do your trial and error. And for any data visualization do's and don'ts, I actually love going to some of these online blogs that Data Wrapper or Flourish publish. They have so much information. You can really say, what should I do with dual axis charts on Data Wrapper, and they have 5 blogs telling you when not to use dual axis charts. And I think it's a huge amount of good information out there. The other thing I recommend doing is, the Database Society really puts highlights onto certain people. So go on their blog platforms, go on their, people who won awards, people who shared their material, see what they're known for and how you can follow their work. I think that's the best way to kind of learn database, because the world is changing so quickly in terms of data visualization. A specific book will probably um, not give you the most recent things that are happening out there. I hope, I know it's a vague answer, but I hope you get some encouragement to explore widely.
And there's so much to that answer. We could talk for hours about
Yeah.
resources to get better at data visualization. There's so much out there. Ankit has asked, how do you validate the quality of data, especially when receiving from different sources for one common topic?
I see. So we we often do the validation of data quality by making sure that we are making the data comparable, um, it's not possible for us to actually check those survey statistics, right? There is some amount of trust in the process that we have to assume, and some margin for error in those surveys. But what we do is we create these sort of gold standard methodologies for each types of indicators. For example, for time use data, we have a pretty gold standard methodology. For measuring gender based violence, we have this particular survey that has to be employed out there. In terms of validating quality, those are the kinds of checks that we do. We try to see whether the surveys were actually followed by those gold standard methodologies, and then present those statistics in terms as close to comparable as we can bring them. And then, of course, there are other types of quality checks that happen at a higher level, which is sort of at the curation level. We do some outlier detection. We do some validation, like we have some hard rules in terms of what you're allowed to, where can the values really lie and where they can't, and so on and so forth. That's the rough way that we validate our data. It's a pretty tricky task. And it goes back down all the way to the surveys. So those checks happen maybe at every stage.
Next up, Jens has asked, what is your estimate of how much of your effort is data wrangling code, filtering, slicing, grouping, aggregating, mapping, etc., versus visualization code, plotting, choosing color symbols, fine-tuning axes, etc.?
It really depends on what I'm working on. There are some times where I actually work with some colleagues who've done the research, they know what the message is, and I'm trying to help them to visualize the data. Then, of course, most of my time is spent in just reshaping the data sometimes. That's maybe 20-30%. And then the rest of it is trying to figure out what is the best visual, and finding the right annotations, finding the right colors, finding the right way to label it so that it's clear and powerful. However, when I'm writing a story like the one in the Atlas, I think we spend a lot of time, maybe even 40 to 50% of the time, maybe that's a stretch, maybe 30 to 40% of the time, really nailing the outline. And then I think maybe about 30% of the time writing the story and cleaning the data. And then the rest of it is the visualization. So it's maybe a third each. One is the outline, doing the research, putting the story together. The other third is doing the data visualization. And the other third is doing the actual writing.
That ties in well to our next question. How do you design the prototype or the story? Is there any inspiration that you use?
Yeah, very often actually. When we look at these stories, when we decide what kind of story we want to tell, we try to look into what is the most relevant research that is happening right now. For example, when we chose the topic on looking at gender and climate change, we knew there was not enough information out there. The other story we could have told was fully focusing on child marriage, and I hope I get to write that story too because it's a pretty big issue. In the world today. But we realized that that was the topic that required uh, more awareness, because we also want to generate more statistics on it. So that was one approach for gender. The other approach for the chapter on hunger was actually that the number one thing that we were talking about was food prices, how food costs are going up. And so that was a way to make sure that when people are talking about something that is timely, they're able to relate to it and find something that's relevant in the development agenda as well, for them to think about. And we actually do the story and talk about how the Ukraine Russia war changed the food prices as well, and really try to bring in something that's timely. So that's the other inspiration we have.
Next up, Leslie has asked, what tips can you share to make estimations or conduct predictive analysis while also ensuring data integrity and quality?
Hmm. Um, The reason I'm pausing is because I don't know if there's a good uniform answer. Again, it's the frustrating answer of it depends on the context. Um, what I what I think is best to do is you want to try and understand what are the main covariates for where you are trying to do the prediction. Do you have information? Do you have enough information to do those predictions? Is the first question you ask yourself. But when you have to start making assumptions, you want to understand how much of it is endogenous versus how much of it is not, and really getting into the econometrics angle. So I would encourage you to do this in collaboration with an expert from that specific topic rather than choosing a broad strategy for predictive analysis. I know that's not the most encouraging answer, but I really do encourage you to seek specific expertise because what is useful in terms of predictive analysis for poverty data will probably be not useful at all for ocean temperatures because the way we measure that data or the way frequency with which we can calculate that data or how we can measure it changes is so completely different.
That makes a lot of sense. We're coming up on time, so we have time for maybe two more questions. We'll see. Nikki has asked, what is your process for working on these visualizations as a team or on your own?
That's a great question. I think the process is that I try to basically all the data that I have, I try to throw it into a visual. If I have some time series data, I'll just throw in all of my countries into a line chart and just see what it looks like. And then, of course, there's a story that I have in mind that I know already exists in the data. And then I try to see how much of that information is relevant for the message that we are trying to portray. Let's say that even though the time trend is important, it's actually not relevant to the message. We want to focus on what's happening current. I kind of try to look into I focus on the current data, but try to do some comparisons even then, just to make sure I'm covering all of the pieces in my story. Some of those draft charts, I think, give us pretty good ideas on where we want to take that visualization forward. But I think at that stage is when I would talk to a designer or I would talk to another colleague of mine who does data visualization to get their opinion on it. And see how we can connect the story to the visual. One good example from some of the charts that I've showed you, I think the bee swarm was a very natural fit for the data we had. We wanted to show something that was below and above, and that kind of gave us some inspiration. Like, okay, we know that we want to show people who are below poverty line and above poverty line, and so it was natural for us to present those dots as people and put them below and above. And so thinking about connecting that design element to the visualization and the topic helps us, kind of narrow down which visualization we want to go for.
Cool. All right, last question. It's going to be by Wing. Have you ever had a story to tell, but the data/research showed opposite of what you thought?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this happens very frequently, and at that point, you have to think whether that whether we are telling an accurate story or not. If we think that we're still telling an accurate story and that data source is not good enough, I think it's a good time to reevaluate the sources that you're using, but also rethink about whether the priors that you have about this topic are still true or not. Perhaps that those priors are actually not true anymore, have changed over time, and so on. For example, the story I was showing you on STEM graduates, some of the highest STEM graduate rates for women are actually in the Middle East, where you would likely see a much lower share of them saying that having a perception of equality compared to other countries. And, based on what you may know about those countries, you may also make that judgment. And while all of those things remain true, it is also true that there are nearly 50-50, women and men in graduate, in STEM programs there. And the reason behind it might be completely different, but it does make you rethink your priors and reevaluate the story that you're seeking. So I would try and trust your data more, and hold your priors less tightly to yourselves. And I think the best story will eventually come out of it.
I think that's a great note to end on. So as we're wrapping up this event, first off, a huge thank you for joining us, especially on your vacation and with the camera troubles. This was such an informational event, and everybody in the chat has said that they enjoyed your presentation and your answers so much. So thank you. Going forward, if people want to follow your work or can contact you with other questions, where can people find you?
You can add me on LinkedIn. I can also add my email on the PowerPoint, so you can reach out to me. And hopefully you can keep in touch with me through the Atlas. I would love to stay in touch with all of you. And I'm sorry I couldn't be available on camera.
Not for lack of trying.
Definitely not. I tried my best.
And you're also in the data visualization Slack, and people can message you here as well.
Absolutely.
So for the audience, if you haven't already checked out the Data Visualization Society, we have a Slack. Feel free to join. There are multiple events like this each month geared towards an early career audience in particular. And hopefully we'll see you at some of those other events. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And thank you, Divyanshi, so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Anne.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone, or whatever it is in your time zones.